Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. And today I have a monologue about a tendency on the left, a tendency towards univocality, or the imagined collective that can speak in one voice. Now, a substrain of the long durée project of what I've been trying to get at is that this, in any concept of unity based off this, a homogeneously, ideologically united class is a misrecognition of what class or even what a person is. You don't speak in one voice. Your voice has different registers. You have things that you say you don't know you mean, not just in projection and Freudian slips and things like that, but also in the implications that you don't see. Your eyes point outward. You are not always aware of everything going on in yourself. Now, I talk about this in standard psychological terms about cognitive dissonance. Sometimes I talk about it in Hegelian terms around the idea of the unhappy consciousness and the realization that there's a part of you that is not you. All right. There's a part of you that is beyond your own finite life, has a history before you and a causality before you, and will have a causality after you are gone and dust. To understand the importance of this is also to get my objections to communization theory as understood by the Endnotes Collective and other such things, but also to get what I've been trying to say as a fundamental left flaw on all of the spectrum of the left. Anarchists do this. Left communists do this. Marxist-Leninists definitely do it, although sometimes they do it less than others, to be frank. Trotskyists do it. And that is the attempt to make the program of the class for itself speak univocally as a singular collective. The problems with this are manifold. One, and now you can see where all these things that I've been talking about start coming into conversation with each other. My talk about cybernetic theory and understanding what a thing does is understanding its actual function in society is related to this notion. My concept of talking about the dialogic, all right, as opposed to the dialectic. The dialectics I don't think are bad. They are necessarily more abstracted than the dialogic. The dialogic lets all the utterances and voices at a time period emerge and be in conversation with each other. My point about programmatic unity as a way to get around the facileness of ideological unity. And my points about complexity always creating kloogs, but that the answer to the kloogs is not to try to enforce top down an artificial unity. That doesn't actually do anything to fix the problem. It actually papers it over, at most works for one generation, and causes everything to fall apart. Bonapartism, as an answer to the progressive liberalism, happens when liberalism is in crisis. The same thing with strongman theories of Marxism. Neither horizontalism nor verticalism as orientational functions fixes this mistake. The horizontalist often become just as sectarian as the verticalist when they try to deal with the fact that the working class is divided and conflicted amongst itself, and that the left is divided and conflicted amongst itself, and cannot conceive of this as actually a good. But to get why I feel this way, you have to understand the way I think about what persons are, and what movements are, and these distinctions, which are often finer grained than we even talk about in Marxism. Yes, there's a class in itself, the sociological reality of the class and your relationship to the mode of production, and the class for itself. The class that can act as a political actor with some unity based off of some program organic to its own goals and towards orienting, hopefully, towards the abolition of class. But those two distinctions are not enough here. There's also the individual, the collective, and the aggregate. All right. The collective is the imagination of a singular unit. A collectivity is not real. The aggregate is what emerges in patterns from people who share some key variable, class, race, whatever, that act in a certain way. There's a tension between the aggregate and the collective. But as Marx says, and while Marx was not always as careful with words as I'm being here, the aggregate makes history. The collective is the imagination of the aggregate. It is an imaginary. Just like a nation is an imaginary. It's an imaginary that has real effect, right? Nations aren't real, and yet they're very real. They can kill you. That duality is hard to get your mind around. But it's also true about your own formation. You know, every now and then liberals will say, well, we're multiple identities. Yes, you actually are multiple identities. You often inherit multiple class positions. Marx was not unaware of this. That's why proletarianization, where you throw your lot in and where you are headed, is more important than what you immediately are. Because you're multiple things at all times. So if you are multiple things, how can everything else not speak univocally? And how can that be a real manifestation of the class for itself? Now, there's some Buddhist philosophy undergirding a lot of this. There's also Hegel, there's other stuff, but I'm going to talk about the deep stuff here. There's a early Theravadan Buddhist text called the Milindapada. And it is about a probably semi-mythical monk, Nagasensha, going to the very real king of Bactria, the Greco Central Asian kingdom. This would now be in part of, like Gandhara, would be in part of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the Buddhist, actually, and one of the interesting things about the Milindapada is the Milindapada is written a lot like an Indian version of a Greek dialogue. And it makes sense because it was aimed partly at a Greek audience, even though it was written in Pali and hybrid Buddhist Sanskrit. The Milindapada talks about Nagasensha, this probably semi-mythic early Buddhist monk, going and approaching the king Milinda. And it very much reads like one of the Hellenistic dialogues, not just of the Socratic schools or the Platonic schools, but also of like the Cynics and Stoics' relationship to Alexander the Great. And what the Milindapada is about is the primary truth of dependent orientation, or how there is no essence to anything in and of itself because everything is aggregate. And thus, anything's identity is dependent on its context, use, and relation. So there's no way to talk about what is the essential form of, say, a chariot. That's the example in the Milindapada. Everything in the chariot has a separate independent identity and multiple independent identities based off of use, context, relation, and need. So there's no essential thing that makes a chariot other than its relationship to a bunch of different contexts. Another example of this is what makes a chair and not a table. Well, it's all about what you're doing at the moment. Which means there is no fixed identity. And in fact, since you exist in multiple contexts and have multiple functions, you have multiple real relationalities and identities. Some of which are within your finite control and some of which are not. Now we fast forward to Hegel, and then we'll even get to the anti-Hegelian philosopher Althusser, all of whom are useful here. There are other concepts to start considering when you consider why we cannot speak univocally, why we cannot speak as a class in one voice, and we shouldn't expect it. Are expecting one too. And I'll talk about the consequences and what this shows, how this shows up in leftist organizing and politics later. Because our dependence on speaking in one voice about the future is part of why we are so fractious, ironically. But let's go back here to the unhappy consciousness. When we realize that our self is not just the atomized individual existing alone in the world, in fact, we can't even recognize the individual until we walk into a person who is not us. You know, this leads to both the master-slave dialectic and the dialectic of self and other in Hegel. Now, there's a lot of religious stuff, specifically Christian religious stuff tied in. And when I talk about this in more detail, I'll talk about the theology, because I think people taking the theology out of Hegel is fundamentally misunderstanding him. He's a Christian German idealist philosopher. Just remember that. He's not a simple Christian, but he is a Christian. Nonetheless, his point here is, for him, the unhappy consciousness is realizing that there's part of the self that's eternal and part of the self that is finite. And that comes out of the relationship to God. But we first manifest it, and part of the self that recognizes others like us and then realizes that they're not us. And understanding that they're not us, we differentiate ourselves from them and have a concrete identity. But the atomized individual loses that identity. It hollows that out. All right, it makes it about presentation. This is the rational core of what I always find to be the underdeveloped theory of Bung Chul Han. That you are always being asked to act as an individual in your own individual self-interest, as if though anything that you can articulate as an individual is truly and uniquely yours. There's no such thing as a private language. All right, because it's non-communicative. What would be its function? So you emerge and understand the world socially. Your categories, even when they are descriptively functioning, come from norms that are beyond you and histories that are beyond you and relations that you cannot control. The primary ones are about the production of society, material production, and social reproduction, which is our big fancy Marxist code word for sexuality, culture, etc. Parts of the so-quote superstructure, although only some of them are in the superstructure, even in that analogy, that reproduce society itself. Ideologies come in play to here as well. Now, what Althusser will help us in dealing with the unhappy consciousness is even awareness of the limitations, and rebellion against the larger social structure doesn't remove you from it. In fact, you become interpolated back into it. So your rebellion is actually serving a social function within the social status quo. Now, what does that have to do with not speaking in one voice? Well, your actions even there both reaffirm parts of the status quo and reject it. This is crucial. The proletariat, the left-wing subject, the left, pick your fucking aggregate or collective, define the variable clearly, but none of it's going to speak in one voice. And any attempt to make it speak in one voice univocally is usually dishonest, and it's a power grab within the category. The left struggles with this because we have clear agendas. That's why I always talk about the importance of orientations. This is what I would like call the minimal program. What defines you as a communist or a Marxist or a leftist, and those are going to be different actually to some degree. A communist should be for a classless society. We're going to disagree on how that comes about, which is why, unlike most people on the ultra left, I'm not about even kicking out people I strongly disagree with, like certain kinds of Marxist-Leninists forever. Certain kinds of people who I think have even defended stuff that I find to be evil and against proletarian interest still emerge organically from the proletariat. Just like I don't speak in one voice and I'm not a singular thing, the proletarian, which is made out of a bunch of people like me and a bunch of different sectional, regional positions, including race and gender, but all these other things that show up as well that we don't talk about enough beyond even nationality, like sub-region, sector of the economy, training, habitats, the distinction patterns, etc. They all matter. The only Marxist sociologist who really ever tried to do a whole lot of this was Eric Olin Wright, and I think he ends up being kind of incoherent because he drops labor theory of value, but nonetheless, he does try. And when we hit this, we keep doing a couple of things. We want to cut people out of the proletariat who make us not univocal. We talk about the lumpen as a class. It's not a class, it's a social category. It's a bunch of people melting out of classes. And it's a problem. It has social pathologies that you have to deal with, and it also directly, not even exploits, extricates resources from other parts of the same classes. Then you have, but that's really now a process which applies to more than just specific classes of people. And a lot of, regular blue collar working class people are half in and half out of the lumpen world. Do we want to kick them out or not? Similarly, the PMC, which are a mixture of petit bourgeois, government functionings like the intellectia, and labor aristocrats, effectively, who are formerly petit bourgeois professions who are being proletarianized, but have strong dependencies on the state. Plus, the state is trying to prop up a petit bourgeoisie to keep it as a kind of internal competition while also crushing it under the weight of its bureaucracy. None of these things exist in one voice, and they can't. So attempts to remove parts of the proletariat because they overlap with these other categories is cutting the proletariat smaller and smaller until it's no longer a viable political subject. You only want blue collar workers? Come on now. How is that liberatory at all? Nor is it a big enough section of the working class, much less the general population, to actually be a viable political subject at this point, and not just in the developed world. The class cannot speak univocally. We have to deal with these contradictions of which the professional managerial strata really is a problem, and that's a strata that goes through multiple classes, actually. But it does not even itself have a consistent culture, and people who try to make it do so often do so by imposing a conspiratorial consistency to make it work. And they have to ignore stuff that breaks their pathetically unified narratives, which also means they're blindsided by stuff they do not see. The anarchists do the same thing in many ways. Anarchists focus not on general broad, anti-status worker democracy, which was the historic norms. An attempt to build consensus where there was not one became a view about consensus itself. And the only reason to be able to maintain a strong consensus, the only way to maintain a strong consensus is compromise. And when compromise cannot be met, you start tossing people out. So anarchists become just as fractious. So horizontalism gets stalled. And then you have the tyranny of structuralistness, where leaders who are not formally leaders and have no accountability as leaders start speaking in the gridlock, which causes more fractiousness and sectarianism amongst anarchists. Similarly, the left communists, who didn't want to deal with, honestly, really corrupted trade unions and whatnot, and the Dutch-German tradition, are corrupted parties in the Italian tradition, to set themselves up defensively to cut out more and more of actually existing workers' organizations and whatnot until they're very tiny sectlets that cannot operate. And they try to freeze time where they want to freeze it. Whether it's Borges having an invariant program, which is basically a development of their Lyon theses in 1926, or Council Communists who want to freeze things to the Soviets that developed in Germany and Russia in 1917. While I'm very sympathetic to the Council Communists, they go so far as to even reject communist control unions as being too vanguardist at some point under Otto Rühle. Marxist-Leninist take the Bolshevik multi-faction, multi-position, and admittedly, under the threat of civil war, where this is a somewhat understandable, if ultimately fatal position, start banning their own factions and turning the faction battles to zero-sum wars. And when you do that, who do you end up purging, killing, and whatever, particularly when you have state power, is your own people. Because you have no way for even internal disagreements not to be zero-sum. When you try to make the communist movement speak in one voice like that, it ends up being dishonestly dominated by, I don't know, one country and one leader, which causes it to split. Because if people stay in it, everything is a fight for zero-sum domination. Trotskyists, similarly, they tried to enforce this down to even sectarian understandings of what the Soviet Union was, often without completely really defining their terms clearly. And it led to split after split after split. Maoist split at least 3-4 different directions, depending on what period of Chinese communist theory, usually in the 60s or 70s, they wanted to glom onto and apply in other areas. And again, to make the proletariat speak one way, they started pretending whole sections of the global proletariat just didn't count. And frankly, if I'm completely honest, also coming up with an imaginary third world proletariat that spoke univocally because they didn't know it and it didn't actually exist in the way that they were portraying it. Trying to make everyone speak univocally, trying to remove the dialogue and the antagonism within the movement, within the multiple voices, tries to impose a false essence and blocks our becoming and ties us even more to the LARPing of the past, because the past can speak univocally, it's dead. And the reason why it can speak univocally is because we're imagining a voice for it. Capiche? So the dialogic is important. That's why I went to the Bakhtin. Complexity is important to deal with, but pseudo answers to complexity accelerate the decline. That's why we talk about tainter. I also pull from classical Marxism, both of the first and second internationals, as well as the early third, particularly the Bolsheviks up to 1918. If you want to know where my politics stands, I think things go wrong for the Bolsheviks between 1919 and 1921, both in their responses in the Civil War, which immediately was understandable, given the context of the Civil War. After all, it was a civil war and the Bolsheviks were under attack, even by left forces. I mean, they were being assassinated by SRs all the time, lower functionaries. But it led to a false univocality that ended up leading to the party cracking under its own weight in the 50s and 60s and having negative effects to the entire communist movement throughout the world. And if you don't think that had a negative effect, no matter how you fall on the Sino-Soviet split, that should never have happened. But notice I've spelled out how Marxist-Leninist, how anarchist, how left communist, refuse to deal with the fact that they cannot impose a univocality on either the left or the working class. Well, this is definitely true with social democrats. So the problem isn't horizontalism or verticalism. It is the assumed nature that somehow once we become the class in ourselves, we will speak in one voice. We will never speak in one voice. The best we will ever do is programmatic harmony. We don't want to speak in one voice. That would effectively be a sign that we were dead as a movement and we're already in the past. And we wouldn't just be LARPing anymore, we'd be reenacting. A surefire sign of the social death of a political movement. Why am I non-sectarian here? I haven't talked about that in a long time. It's not because I'm not sectarian as a person. I'm hyper-sectarian as a person. I get called a Trotskyite all the time, or an anti-left communist, or a secret Bakuninist, or a secret Bukharinist. I'm sympathetic to Bukharin in the early stages of the development of socialism, but ultimately I think market socialism is a dead end. We might have to go through a market socialist period, but it is still effectively capitalist. It doesn't even meet my definition of what socialism would be according to Critique of the Goethe program. But even that, I must be open to change. Socialism as a movement must be a living thing that speaks multiple voices, but has enough programmatic unity and enough similar orientations to move polyglotly and in multiple directions towards the same general goal. And that's also true for yourself. You will have conflicting feelings and conflicting emotions and conflicting alliances. That's tragic. There's something tragic about that realization. There's something about the unhappy consciousness that leftists have trouble dealing with, because we don't want to believe that that tragedy is still going to exist even into, whatever great socialist future we end up making, if we do at all. But it will. It absolutely will. And so do not expect any communist movement to be that unified. Do not expect any workers' movement to be that unified. It wouldn't even be good if it was. It would be a sign that we were already dying. Or it would be a sign that we were about to split and go into violent civil wars within ourselves, not just in our nations or whatever. Multivocality, polyglotness, heteroglossia, common orientation with the allowance for divisions, of sincere disagreement with people who still share the same ultimate goals and immediate program. That is what a viable, functioning, possible political movement would do. And that, in its best and worst periods, is what our enemies were able to do, and we were often not. When it descends into total chaos and there's no common orientation anymore, yes, that is also a sign of social death. And we see this on the right now in a lot of ways. But that can lead to things like left melancholia, but it can reverse itself. Because in that sadness, in that unhappy consciousness, you see the flip side and the possibility for movement and your need for relationality. Right now, we're in a particularly weird point for the left. You're going to see a lot of strange formations, and then if the Republicans win the next election, you'll see a lot of attempts to tie us back to the Democratic Party, etc., etc., etc. This is to be expected and is not even necessarily bad. But let us use it to quit trying to impose a static vision of what we are that speaks in one voice, and know that we can harmonize and keep who we are, and even disagree sometimes, and still have an ultimate trajectory. If your idea of left unity is the Borg, then you're probably going to get wiped out by a computer virus. You're not robust or anti-fragile enough. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, have a Patreon. For as little as $3, you can get more rants. Q&As, additional stuff, the audio for all this, so you don't have to watch my silly mug on the computer screen. If you don't have Patreon money, I'd be happy for comments, reviews on the podcast feed and Apple, in any place you listen to it, Apple, Spotify, etc., and all of them. The public podcast feed goes out a little later than the YouTube and a lot later than the Patreon feed, but a lot of the stuff is going to be there for free for always, and I would just like people to have access to it. And share this on your socials if you're so inclined, or don't. You can also talk shit about me. It helps my audience score. Fuck it. So do whatever you want to do, but if you want to help this out as an educational project, I'd love to. I want to be clear by that. I think I'm an educational project. I have politics and there's political projects that I'm doing. They are related to this, but they're not the same. Again, polyvocality, right? So don't confuse this with doing politics, but also don't pretend it's not related. That doesn't make sense either. This is a political educational project. I task you to do something with it. I don't know what all we can do with all this information, but I think one thing is from this polyvocality is realize that there's going to be conflicts within the working class, both along lines that we're used to, race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, and lines that we're not used to, sectionality, labor aristocracy, position within general society, social categories, lumpenization, political pathologies, etc. I task you to be okay with those divisions, to be okay with students being cringe or whatever, but also to not be afraid to stand apart from them and still see yourself as part of the same movement. Don't get into the raucous carnival alone. You need more than that. But don't think you can impose unity from the outside. And with that, good night and good luck. Keep your peace and battle for a better tomorrow. And while everyone says left is best, why don't you actually make it so?